Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is Joy Burkhardt, and we're so pleased to have you with us today for the first webinar in our series called Models That Made It, and there's actually a great story behind that name that we'll get into in just a moment. Today's session, we're featuring Postpartum Support Virginia's Peer and Provider-led support groups, and we're just so thrilled to have Adrienne Griffin with us today. She's going to tell us a little bit about herself in just a moment. Before we get started, let me go over a few logistics and also just tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming webinars in a couple of our series that we're launching. So first, I wanted to share that we invite you to use the GoToWebinar control panel that all of you who are logged in should be able to see. It's a rectangular box on the side of your computer. The way we'd like for you to be able to submit questions is to use that question feature. You're all muted now. You can ask a question at any time. We'll be pausing at the end of today's webinar for Q&A, and we'll be asking and directing questions to Adrienne at that time. So we also wanted to share that this is the first in the series of models that made it. We will be featuring several other programs that have been successful, various reasons in the series. And Adrienne, I'm just going to mention that we can hear some background noise, so just want to point that out. I think that might be coming from you. So we will be featuring a couple other great webinars in this series, including the winners of the Innovation Awards program, which some of you may be following, which is a program of both 2020 Moms and also the Perinatal Mental Health Society, which is a research organization. So we're excited about that partnership, and we'll be giving our 3 Innovation Award winners and our 3 nominees that didn't get the winning position but were recognized as honorable mentions an opportunity to share their programs with you in this series. So with that, it's my pleasure to first tell you just a smidge about 2020 Mom. Some of you may know that our mission is to close gaps in maternal mental health care. So that's quite broad, as you can imagine. One of the things that we really pride ourselves in doing is lifting up best practices, which is why we've launched this series, Models That Made It. We'll be offering the webinars in this series and a few other series to all of you free of charge through the end of this year, and then we'll be launching a webinar membership platform through our new website that will be launched 1/1 as well, so more to come on all of that. I did also want to make one more announcement that there's a handout that you'll be able to pull down and look at through the GoToWebinar control panel. You can see that gray box that says handouts, and there's a written handout about Adrienne's program that you'll be able to find there. We'll make sure that this is also loaded to our website for anyone else who wants to pull it down. You may not be able to save it directly from the GoToWebinar control panel. Sometimes people have difficulty. So you'll get a link to that document on our website after today's webinar. Finally, I'll say this webinar is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to come back and listen to it again, and the recording will be sent out in a couple of days through email. And now, I'll say again without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Adrienne Griffin, and I think many of you know Adrienne. She's really a cornerstone to the maternal mental health movement and has been involved in the movement for a very long time and very much a champion that so many of us have come to grow and love and really appreciate her ability to synthesize moving pieces, help create clarity around what needs to be done to move and motivate change. And it was actually Adrienne that said, Joy, I think you really should be highlighting models that made it. And so it was her term that led to the creation of this series of webinars called Models That Made It. And Adrienne, just want to thank you on behalf of not only 2020 Mom, but everyone who's on the line today and the whole movement for your leadership and ongoing support. You have just a way about you that excites people and clearly have lots of programmatic experience that can help all of us move the needle going forward. So thank you for being with us, and you can see Adrienne is the founder and executive director of Postpartum Support Virginia, and also the Mid-Atlantic coordinator for Postpartum Support International, one of our dear sister nonprofits. Adrienne, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and please give us a little more background about yourself, and we'll navigate through your slides shortly.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Joy. It's a pleasure to be invited to be part of this, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy days to be with us today to discuss peer and provider-led support groups. And actually, you know, a funny story to add on to Joy's story, part of the way this came about is I was on her website and found that there was a position paper about support groups and how some of these more formal for-profit organizations like Fit for Moms or Mommy and Me yoga classes, like those were actually more beneficial than peer support groups. And I said, wait a second, Joy, we need to talk about that. And so that was part of the conversation that led to this broadcast. So if we can just go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about our favorite topic, which is support groups. So we're talking about the happiest time in a family's life, right? This is what everybody thinks it's going to be like to have a brand new baby. I just love these pictures. And then if we go to the next slide, we see what it's really like. Not always is it the most joyful time. We've got the dirty dishes, the overflowing laundry, the piles of diapers, and just to point out that little girl in the middle in the blue and white, that would be one of my children having the toddler fit. And so it's not always the happiest time in our life. If we go to the next slide, you'll see me with my postpartum baby on the left. That's my little guy, John, 15 years ago. And there he is on the right. Now he is 6'3" and a teenager. And he was actually my second child. If you go to the next slide, Joy, here's a little bit about me. I had postpartum issues after my second child was born. He's now 15. I've been married for 20 years. I had no history of anxiety or depression. In fact, my first child was the absolute picture-perfect baby. Easy pregnancy, easy baby. I could set my watch by the time she took her naps. And then baby 2 came along, and it was a completely different story. It was an emergency C-section. It was very scary. He's a much needier baby. He wouldn't take a bottle. I was overwhelmed, exhausted, and kind of going out of my mind. The good news is that I got better. We actually had a third child, and I now have my fourth child, which is Postpartum Support Virginia. I started PSVa in 2009 with just 2 other women. And last year, currently we have about 50 volunteers. We run 20 support groups all around the state. Our primary mission is to support moms and families through our support groups and a warm line. We provide them information and resources, including referrals to mental health providers, and we also do some outreach and education. So there are several other state organizations, kind of like Postpartum Support Virginia. There's about 5 of us that have been around for a while, and we all sort of do the same thing, and we're all somewhat affiliated with Postpartum Support International. So at the bottom of the page, you see what our mission is, and our vision is that all childbearing women in Virginia will receive information about maternal mental health disorders and have access to help. So for us, next slide please, the access to help consists primarily of our free peer support groups. And we started leading support groups, in 2005, 2004, something like that. And we started, like I said, with just 2 support groups, and we've refined our model over time, making tweaks, and we've really come up with a model that we think works pretty darn well. And so I'm going to walk through that today. The overarching components of this model are, number 1, that it's free, it's ongoing, and it's drop-in. We provide psychosocial support, and we like our groups to be based in hospitals. And I'm going to talk through each one of these 3 things, with a little bit more detail. So again, our whole goal, if we go to the next slide, our primary goal is to eliminate any barrier to care. So what do I mean by that? To me, it means, number 1, that the groups are free. We don't even ask for donations. We don't want women to feel any financial pressure if they attend one of our groups. We know that oftentimes women experiencing PMADs feel very undeserving of help. They may feel unworthy. They may be home on maternity care and not earning any money. They may be paying money for childcare and I remember clearly when I went through my postpartum issues, you know, I was no longer working. So I remember saying to my husband, not only am I not bringing in income, but we need to spend money on my mental health. And so we really try to eliminate any kind of cost component for our groups. Our groups are also ongoing and drop-in. So what do I mean by that? We don't have a start and finish date. I remember calling out, making phone calls and finding support groups, and they were like, well, our group just ended. We had a 6-week session and it just ended and we won't be starting again for 6 months, or our group doesn't meet for another 6 weeks. And I remember thinking in that time, well, in 6 weeks or 6 months, I may not be here. Like, I needed something now. And so that was very, very frustrating to me that groups would start and finish. And so we decided that our groups would always be ongoing and drop-in. You don't have to register. You can just show up. We know that, again, we're trying to eliminate any barrier to care. Our groups always meet at the same time and the same location. So most often our goal is to meet twice a month. And for example, we want a group to meet, say, the first and third Wednesday mornings of the month at the same time and the same location. We often have groups when they want to get started, they say, well, we want to do one during the day and one in the evening so we can capture, you know, moms who are at home or moms who are working. And I always say to them, you know, we've got to remember, moms are a little overwhelmed. We need to make this as easy as possible. They can't be trying to figure out, is it the first week that it meets in the day and the third week that meets in the evening? So we try to make it very, very simple. Same time, same day, same location, twice a month. We have some volunteers who say, oh, you know, I want to do a group every week. And then we have other volunteers who say, well, you know, I can only do it once a month. We have found over time that every other week or twice a month really works the best. Once a month is not enough for the moms. When you say to a mom who calls, you know, our next group meets in 3 or 4 weeks, that's not always helpful. And we also find that once a week is way too much for any volunteer. So again, over time, we've kind of refined this, that we really find that every other week or the first and third or the second and fourth weeks of the month works really, really well. Babies, of course, are always welcome. Babies in arms are welcome. Moms may be too anxious to leave their baby, or they don't have childcare, or they're exclusively breastfeeding, and so they may want to or need to bring their baby, which is actually great because then we can see how they're interacting with baby. You know, oftentimes moms will say, I don't know how to take care of my baby. Meanwhile, they'll be bouncing their baby and burping their baby and feeding their baby, and it's an opportunity to give them that positive reinforcement that they actually do know how to take care of the babies. Now, some women will choose to attend the group without their baby, which is fine as well. It's an opportunity for them to get a little time off and to model some good self-care. So either way is fine. But of course, babies are welcome. Of course, moms can breastfeed at our groups. Absolutely. We always say, come as you are, when you can, as long as you can. So, you know, moms in this time frame often say, well, I have to take extra care to look good because I don't want anybody to think that I'm struggling. You know, we know these moms are struggling. We're saying, come however you can get here. Come in your pajamas, bring the dog, have your mother come with you, whatever it takes to get you in that room. And we will be there for the entire hour and a half. All of our groups are an hour and a half. And we will be there the entire time, even if nobody shows up. When we first started our group, nobody came for the first several months, and it was just the other group leader and I, and we committed that we would stay there the entire time. And it paid off because during one of those meetings, somebody showed up within the last 15 minutes, and we were still there. We always remind ourselves, you know, it's hard to get out the door when you're a new mom. It's hard to get out the door if you have a baby. It's hard to get out the door if you're anxious or depressed. And when you put both of those things together, it's kind of a wonder that anybody ever gets to our support groups. And so we are committed to be there the entire time, even if nobody shows up till the last 15 minutes. Oftentimes, women will ask if they can bring their older child, a toddler, somebody who might not be in school yet. And while it's not ideal, we will say, you know, if that's the barrier to you getting there, well, then of course bring your child. And you may want to bring something for that child to be entertained, a video or a game or some snacks or whatever. And quickly, mom will realize that it's not ideal to have a toddler or another child there because she can't really focus on herself or her baby. But if that's what it takes for her to get there, you know, then we say, of course, bring them. Because again, our goal is to eliminate any barrier to care. Okay, so that's sort of platform number one. Groups are free, they're ongoing and drop-in. They meet at the same time and location. They meet twice a month. Babies are welcome, of course. Breastfeeding is encouraged and supported, as is any type of feeding for baby. And we say, come as you are, as long as you can. And we have some moms who keep coming, and they then become our next support group leaders. Okay, so we're going to move on to number two, pillar number two. And as Joy mentioned, this information is all in that PDF and has all the details that I'm talking through. So feel free to download that and either follow along or read over later. Okay, so point number two, our facilitators are peers and they provide psychosocial education. What does that mean? Well, we've realized that we need to have a team of well-trained facilitators who bring different perspectives to have a successful group. So we've created a training, an 8-hour training to educate our support group leaders, both about maternal mental health disorders and how to effectively run a group. And we now require that all of our support group leaders go through our training. If we're going to advertise and promote our groups, then we want to make sure that our facilitators know what they're doing and are prepared to handle an emergency or a crisis or anything that may come their way. So we just really feel it's very, very important that they have the requisite knowledge and skills for this important position. We actually just did a training in Richmond, which is our state's capital, and we had 17 women attend, and we're going to launch 4 support groups out of that. And we just spent the whole day together on Saturday, and our training consists of an overview of PMADs, and we asked them to do some homework before they come. So it's just sort of an overview of maternal mental health disorders. And then we spend a great deal of time talking about how to run a group dynamics. We do a whole bunch of scenarios and role playing. We work through everything from the baby blues on up through anxiety and depression. And we role play some scenarios with scary situations of suicidal thoughts or somebody who might be psychotic, because we've dealt with all of this in our groups and we want them to be prepared. We know that these situations are rare, but we certainly want to make sure that our support group leaders have the training and the skills and the knowledge about how to handle these tough situations. We found that a team approach is really important. We want at least 2 facilitators at each meeting. One facilitator is typically a more senior person and is running the group, while the second one can welcome new members coming in because people are always straggling in, can hand out information or tissues, can give a mom a break by holding the baby if mom needs to go to the bathroom, something like that. And importantly, can help out if there's a crisis situation. So let me give you an example. One of our groups very, very early on, we had a mom show up who was very concerned that we were videotaping the session. And so she was accusing us of having hidden cameras, and she was looking under chairs, and she was acting in a very, very strange way. So fortunately, she had already filled out her registration form in the group, and so one of the facilitators was able to take her out into the hallway and talk with her and contact her husband, who could come and get her because she really needed some more care than we could provide at the group. Another time, we got a call from a therapist that she was sending a mom to our group who had been expressing some suicidal ideations. And so I was able to meet with that mom outside the group before she went in and just get a sense of how she was doing and making sure that she was appropriate for the group and the group was appropriate for her. So we really always want to have at least 2 facilitators present. And we find that oftentimes we need 3 or 4 facilitators to maintain a group that can run twice a month. So this way, if people are on vacation or something comes up and they can't make it, they have somebody on their team who can step in and keep that group going. So one of our facilitators is always a peer. And what do I mean by a peer? I mean somebody who is a survivor of postpartum depression or anxiety, who has lived through this and who can say, I've been there. This simple statement provides much needed validation and normalization and hope for recovery. I remember when I was going through this, all I wanted was for somebody to say, oh, honey, I'm sorry you're having a tough time. You know, I went through this, and here's what I did to get better, and I can help you get better too. So that's why we find it's really, really important to have a peer as one of the facilitators. And I also mean as a peer, as a youngish mom. We have a support group right now that is being led by 3 very lovely ladies who all happen to be in their 60s. And so while they may be peers in the sense that they had an experience with postpartum depression or anxiety, they're not peers in the sense that they are not the same age as the moms. So even I, who I still think of myself as young, have kind of moved beyond being a peer in terms of age. So we just try to keep that in mind. We also want one of our support group leaders to be a clinician of some sort. So it can be a nurse, it can be a mental health provider, a lactation consultant, somebody who has either a medical or a mental health background who can bring something else to the discussion. So when I started the support group years ago, I did it with another woman who was a survivor of postpartum depression, but she's a pediatric nurse. And so she could say things like, you know, in my 20 years of nursing, of working with new moms, I often hear moms say, whatever. So again, adding some normalization and validation, but also a professional perspective. And then finally, we pair up our facilitator team with a mental health provider who can be on call during that support group meeting should a crisis happen. So for example, since neither I nor my nurse partner, neither of us had mental health experience. So we had a therapist who was on call if there was any kind of emergency situation or something we didn't know how to deal with, that we could call and say, hey, can you help us out with this situation? So we find this to be very helpful, particularly for new volunteers, new facilitators who may, you know, just need a little bit of a backup plan or a safety net, just to make them feel even more secure in their setting. Okay, so again, we make sure that our facilitators have appropriate training. We want a team approach that includes both peers and clinicians, and we always have mental health support on call. Okay, and then the third leg of the stool is that we want to have our support groups in hospitals. Joy, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, and so why in hospitals? Now, let me preface this by saying that we know there's no perfect setting for a support group, but we've really decided that the hospital is the best place for our support groups. If you can go back one slide, please. And here's why, for a bunch of different reasons. Number one, hospitals are safe and accommodating to moms and babies. Most likely, mom has been at the hospital, either her obstetric provider is somehow connected with that hospital. Like where I live, you know, there's the hospital and then there's office medical buildings all kind of around it. Most often mom has delivered at the hospital. We find that hospitals have ample parking and are well lit and have, you know, automatic doors and wide hallways that are accessible to strollers. And so, you know, from sort of a safety perspective, we find that the hospital is a good place for this. We also know that hospitals can help support the support group. What do I mean by this? If it's in a hospital, the hospital has some obligation to help publicize the group. So they can include it on their website or on social media or in their newsletters. At the hospitals where we lead our support groups, we give them fact sheets about postpartum depression and other maternal mental health disorders to include in their maternity discharge paperwork. And on that fact sheet, we include information about the support group that is affiliated with that hospital. So again, we try to get moms, you know, eliminating any barriers to care. They have that information in their discharge packet before they even leave the hospital. We also then leverage that hospital and their level of persuasion to go around to the healthcare providers affiliated with the hospital, the OBs and the pediatricians, and we give them our fact sheets and information cards and ask that they distribute them to new mothers during pregnancy or the first year postpartum. Hospitals also have emergency medical staff. So for example, in that situation I described earlier about the mom who was concerned that the room is being videotaped, if she really, really was acting in a psychotic way, we could easily escort her down to the emergency room and get her some care. Now, imagine if you were not in a hospital. Say, for example, that support group was being held maybe in a church basement or in a library, maybe in the evening, you know, where the support group leaders are all alone. It could be a little scary. So again, we find that being in the hospital setting provides a level of safety and comfort should there be an emergency situation. We also find that having a group in a hospital helps dispel some of the stigma associated with a mental health support group. Hospitals have all kinds of support groups. They have new mom support groups. They have cancer support groups. They have all kinds of support groups. So this helps sort of make it more of a medical situation than a mental health situation. And it's really easy for a mom to say to people, hey, I'm going to the hospital for an appointment. And finally, hospitals have all kinds of other support groups. So again, at the hospital where I started my support group, the woman who was my co-facilitator had been running a new moms group there for about 20 years. So that's where I went when I was looking for help. But that was all the happy moms. So she and I decided, well, let's start a postpartum support group. And the way we decided to do this is her new moms group met the first and third Wednesdays of the month. So our postpartum support group met at the second and fourth Wednesday mornings of the month. And we did the same room, the same time, the same day of the week. So we say to new moms, you could come any Wednesday from 10:30 to 12, and there will be somebody here. So that also made it easier for moms to remember when and where the group was. And then another mom came along who also had postpartum issues, and she was a lactation consultant, and she started a breastfeeding support group that meets every Wednesday. So we then also refer moms back and forth among these different groups. We know that a lot of women will come to the breastfeeding support group but maybe experiencing anxiety, which is leading to their breastfeeding challenges. So we'll refer them to the postpartum support group. So it works really well, and we have a whole team then of facilitators who can back each other up and help out with these different groups. So again, like I said, there is no perfect place for a support group. We know for some women who may have a traumatic birth that going back to the hospital may be challenging. So in cities or regions where we have a lot of support groups, we try to stagger them on different days of the week, some in the morning, some in the evening. We're getting one started on a Saturday morning. And this way, if mom had can't maybe go back to the hospital where she delivered, she could go to one of the other support groups. And also, our groups are open to any mom. It doesn't matter where they delivered, whether they delivered in the hospital, at home, you know, in a different hospital system, it doesn't matter. They can come to any group that we provide. Okay, moving on to our next slide. We know that support groups and social support are just one of the many ways that women can get back on the path to wellness after experiencing a maternal mental health disorder. And so these are some of the things that we also talk about in our support groups. We always start with self-care. We know that particularly sleep is so important. We always say it's the most important, least expensive, most effective thing that a mom can do for herself. We also talk about making sure they're eating properly, high protein snacks and meals throughout the course of the day, drinking plenty of water, getting some exercise and some time off. And I'm not talking about running a marathon. I'm talking about a walk around the block, maybe without baby, so that mom can get 10 or 15 minutes of time to herself. We know how important it is to mother the mother and help her recover from the physical and emotional toll of being pregnant and birthing a baby. So we always start with self-care. We talk about social support, how important it is for moms to get connected with each other, and then they can validate and normalize and offer hope for each other. We make referrals to trained mental health providers. And again, in the group, it becomes so normal. Moms will say, oh, I'm seeing so-and-so, and I'm, here's my psychiatrist and here's my therapist, and it makes it okay for women to get the additional help that they need. And we talk about medication, that in some cases, women may need medication, and that's okay. There are safe and effective medications to take while mom is pregnant or breastfeeding. Of course, it's always a risk-benefit analysis, and we never tell her which medications to go on, but we open the door for the possibility that maybe she could consult with a psychiatric provider if she's not doing well. Okay, the next slide. Some of the things that we talk about in our support groups, topics for discussion. You know, I remember when I was starting a support group, I was like, well, what if nobody comes, or what if nobody talks? Well, that's never a problem. Most women love to talk, and particularly during this time frame, they're really looking to process what has happened, whether they had a traumatic birth or whether their baby is very challenging or whatever it is. We often find that we don't have enough time for moms to speak. However, we do also encourage our support group leaders to have, you know, maybe some kind of worksheet or an activity or something, you know, just in case the group kind of stalls. But again, we never find that to be a problem. Attendance is something that I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on. You know, the new moms groups and the breastfeeding support groups, they may have scores of women show up. I mean, sometimes that breastfeeding support group that met after our postpartum support group, they would have like 40 moms. And I would always say, why is it okay to have problems with breastfeeding, which is supposed to be so natural, but it's not okay to have problems with, you know, anxiety or depression? What? But anyway, they were getting the help that they needed. But my point is, with the postpartum support groups, you know, we never get 20 people. We may get 2, we may get 10, we may get 14. Women may come once, find that it was all that they needed. Some women come again and again and again, and we have to eventually ask them to, like, either become a support group leader or, you know, maybe, you know, do something else for the organization. So, you know, if a mom doesn't come once, we reach out to her again, find out how she's doing. But in general, you know, it's much spottier than, say, you know, a breastfeeding group where you know, they're all the well moms who are getting there. A word or two about outreach and publicity. One of the things that we do when we start a support group is, you know, we realize it's not like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. Well, not always. We got to tell people about it. You know, just because you start a group doesn't necessarily mean that all the providers affiliated with the hospital or wherever you have your group know about it. So we spent a lot of time going around to the OB's offices and the pediatrician's offices and connecting with the childbirth educators and the nursing staff at the hospital, reminding them that we have the group, giving them information cards to pass out to new moms. So we help our facilitators get their group up and running and help them figure out how to give some publicity and awareness to the group within their setting. Okay, so our final slide, I think, is the most important thing that we try to get across to these women, what we call the universal message. And this comes all the way from Jane Honickman, who started this work, you know, 35 years ago. At her home in Santa Barbara when she started Postpartum Support International. So important that we get these 3 points across to women. You are not alone, you are not to blame, and with help you will be well. We find that all women who go through a maternal mental health disorder really believe that they are the only ones who have felt like this. And many times we believe it's our fault. We've done something wrong. Our body is failing us. You know, we really try to normalize and validate that this is a real illnesses, but that fortunately with help you will be well. And I remember every time I watch the PSI video, Peck Inman is in it, and she says that every woman who gets treatment gets well again, which is so, so reassuring. And we say that to women. If you get the proper treatment, there is no reason why you can't feel like your old self again. So I think, yes.
I'm just saying thank you on behalf of everyone. I think you've covered it. Was there something else you were going to say?
No, I think that's the end, right? The next slide is my contact information. And I am more than happy to answer questions now, or if you think of anything later, that's my cell phone, that's my email address. You can check out information on our website. We have all kinds of forms, our fact sheets, our information cards, the path to wellness. We encourage you to use all of those things. Don't reinvent the wheel. We'll post this, the PDF with the support group model. I'll post that to our website. You're welcome to use anything that we have.
Adrienne, thank you. I know probably every single person, there's 70 of you on live now, and about 100 plus people who registered who couldn't make it live, who will be watching the recording, are probably very excited about what they just heard. And Adrienne, I wanted to thank you for first also pointing out that, you know, we were in these camps, 2020 Mom. Our position was that, you know, largely what we've learned going out into the field and connecting with people is that support groups are very hard. And I think those of you on the line can acknowledge that it seems like painful work if you're a support group leader and that people don't show up. And that's what we kept hearing over and over again. We also learned that it sort of takes a specific personality profile to do this and do this well. And Adrienne, I think one of the things that really resonated with your work that appealed to me, you know, numerous things, but and thank you for going over so many. I'm gonna recap what I heard in just a moment. But really, I think we acknowledge that not everyone is cut out for this work, and that there is a lot of benefit to having both a peer and a clinician. I love that you brought up age, sort of age being relevant. Even if other peers are involved, at least two should be involved, and one peer should be in the same sort of childbearing age group, if you will. Just really critically important. And you opened our eyes to support group models at work, and we're so just very thrilled to have you present today. I have several questions that came in. One of the things that we want to ask you about, though, Adrienne, before we jump into some of the questions is, you know, we know that your model has made it because there has been reach, success, longevity to your program. Can you tell us a little bit about how many support groups do you run in Virginia? How long have you been running these support groups with success? Just so folks can really feel good about, as if they haven't already figured it out, right? But really feel good about the fact that your model has made it.
Absolutely. So our first support group, I started our first support group, I'm pretty sure it was in 2005. And, you know, I have to tell you, for the first 6 months or so, nobody showed up because we didn't tell anybody about it. We just thought, well, if we're sitting here, of course they'll come. And, you know, it takes a lot of work to get the word out about your group. And there are some times when still nobody shows up. And then the next week, you know, 10 moms will show up. So again, we always try to remind our facilitators that you're dealing with new moms who are having a hard time. And so it's hard for them to get out the door. So we do some things like we send an email reminder or a text reminder a few days before the group so that we know, moms are overwhelmed. It may not even be on their radar screen. So those who have attended or who have expressed interest in the group, who have registered online or contacted us in some way, we send them an email reminder. So right now we have 20 groups around the state. Our goal is to have a support group at each of the 55 hospitals in our state that delivers babies. And, you know, we're getting set to launch like 3 or 4 groups in Richmond. I've been invited down to Norfolk and Virginia Beach to do a training there in November. We're going to be doing some training in Charlottesville, which is another little city that delivers about 4,000 babies a year. We've gotten connected with one of our big hospital systems, the Inova system. They have 4 hospitals that provide maternity services to 15,000 babies a year. And so we have now support groups at 3 out of those 4 hospitals. You know, it's not easy work. It really takes a lot of time and effort. And that's why with an organization like ours, I mean, I have our support group leaders, but I'm the one who still is, you know, meeting with the hospital leadership and helping get these groups launched and helping spread the word about them, publicizing them. You know, it takes a lot of work. And, you know, groups are always I shouldn't say always in flux, but, you know, the women who lead our groups are moms themselves, and so need to take time off periodically. And so we're always cultivating new support group leaders, whether nurses in the hospital or women who've come through our support group who have been very articulate about their experience. We say, oh, when that mom gets better, we want her to be a support group leader.
That's great. There's a couple questions that come to mind. I know there's quite a few questions that have come in. Before we go into the next round of questions, though, and even my question, I want to ask the folks that are on the line, there's 70 of you, there's a raise your hand feature on your control panel, and we want to hear from you. We're going to ask, number one, are you with the hospital? Raise your hand if you are, and then we're going to ask, we'll put everyone's hands down, then we're going to ask, are you an advocate? So a peer, and then we'll have you put your hands down, and then we'll say other. So we just want to see who's on the phone, and I do think one of the things that has really made this program work is that Postpartum Support Virginia is a nonprofit organization, and I think many of you on the line today may be from hospitals, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. So feel free to put them in as questions about, wow, this would be great if we had a nonprofit organization or an advocate who could do this work like Adrienne has done in our community. Let me start, though, by going back to my first question. How many of you, and use that raise your hand feature on your control panel, if it looks like a little hand, how many of you are with hospitals that are on the call today? If you can raise your hand. Hi, Anita. I see your hand up. Let's see how many people are putting their hands up. And Amelia and Anne, Brandy, a lot of you, Diane, Christina. It looks like, boy, it's probably safe to say about half, 45% of you have put your hands up. That's really helpful. And I'm going to put your hands down, and let's see how many of you are on because you have suffered yourself and want to become an advocate and a peer and do something around support groups. So raise your hand if you want to do support group work. Maybe you are doing support group work. You're not with a hospital. And Millie, I see you and just want to say hello. So quite a few hands up again. I would say about 30% of what we're seeing, Adrienne, are peers, and I think some of you wear double hats. All right, everyone else, if you're not with a hospital or have suffered yourself, raise your hand. Let us know if others are out there. So Anita and Antoinette, Brittany. So those of you that raised your hands just now, there's about Jennifer, Kaylee, Loretta. Let us know what role you play. Margaret. So you may be running support groups in large clinic settings, for example. We'd love to hear what your role is. So go ahead and put that in the questions feature. And we've got about 15 minutes or so left for today's Q&A. And Adrienne, there's quite a few questions that came in, so I'm going to go ahead and get to those. Can you tell us now about, Adrienne, I think you touched on this. You told us you have about 20 support groups and your goal is to have about 55 because you want one support group associated with every birth hospital, which is a great goal in Virginia. How many facilitators do you generally have in your network? You talked about cultivating them and doing training. Anything else you want to say about the number of facilitators generally associated with each support group?
Right, so, you know, as I said, we'd like to have at least 2 facilitators at every meeting. And so we're finding that a team of 3 to 4 support group leaders affiliated with any one support group really works well. And ideally, we'd like to have one person who's committed to coming all the time or as much as possible. It's kind of frustrating if you're a new mom and you come 1 week, and you tell your story, and then you show up 2 weeks later for the next support group meeting, and there's 2 new support group leaders, and so you're basically starting all over again, and we all know how hard that is. So we really try to have, you know, one person who's dedicated to being there all the time, and maybe 2 others who maybe alternate So that's what we're finding really works well. And then there's backup if somebody is sick or needs to go on vacation or something like that.
That's great. I'm going to summarize quickly what I heard you say are really the reasons for success, your longevity, your reach. So I'm going to spell them out and chime in, Adrienne, if there's something that I've missed or something else that you want to hit on. So number one, peer and provider support group led. So there's at least 2 support group leaders, maybe 3 or 4, to your point, for consistency, etc. You also pointed out that the peer, there has to be at least one peer that is in the same sort of childbearing age range, even if there's a 65-year-old peer who cares deeply about this topic who's also involved. So peer plus provider led, number one. Number 2, hospital setting for various reasons, including the fact that it helps normalize maternal mental health disorders and also helps ensure that there's a place to go, even if there's not a psychiatric inpatient unit, et cetera, or a psychiatrist on staff, that there's a place for an emergency and support there. Marketing, you pointed out the fact that you did these groups for the first 6 months and no one came. So you can't just build it and come, which is what we think often happens. And often it's a clinician who may not be childbearing age or have a family herself, and people just can't relate even if they do show up. So a hospital setting is important, and also peer plus provider setting is important, and hospitals for various reasons. The next thing is that you train your providers, your peers, and perhaps your clinicians who also haven't been trained in maternal mental health disorders. A 2-hour training, it sounds like it's a fantastic overview. I know one of the questions that came in is like, can you tell us again, share your curriculum for training, if there's something you can share. Good.
Absolutely. And actually, it's a 6 to 8 hour training, not a 2-hour training.
Oh, 6 to 8. Thank you. 6 to 8 hour training. Perfect. The other thing that resonated about why your model may be so successful as a success factor is that you cover sort of this path to wellness, and you don't have one start and stop date on this path. It sort of fluctuates, but you cover key things like getting out and walking and socialization and getting, speaking with other moms, getting exercise, sleep, etc. So this path to wellness is part of your core curriculum, if you will, for support groups. That seems like a success factor. And then you also said there's no end date. It's continuous. People can show up at any time. There's always someone there, and it's free. So those seem to be the sort of the nuggets, if you will, of what has made this work so well. I pointed out earlier, I think what's beautiful about your work is that you're not just doing this as a hospital, LCSW, like so many, I'm guessing, maybe a good portion of the folks on the line, an RN or an LCSW, just trying to do this in your own hospital, that you are a nonprofit who's partnering with hospitals and can provide that additional marketing support, and outreach to the OB community, even doing rounds with the hospital clinicians that perhaps the LCSW and RN staff at hospitals don't have an ability to do. Did we forget anything, Adrienne, out of that list?
I have to laugh, I have to chuckle on the last point because, I look at it very differently. Like, I am an outsider trying to encourage, nay, force a hospital to offer a service, where I think that I assume that it's easier if you're in the system as a social worker or a nurse on the, labor and delivery to say, hey, you know what? I see this need in our hospital. Let's do something about it. I mean, I'm basically like pushing a rock uphill, I feel like. So it's funny that you would say, because as a nonprofit, we can offer more support and, the community voice and all that. It's funny how it cuts both ways. I'm constantly going to them. I'm an outsider basically saying, hey, I think you really ought to be doing this, and I can help your hospital do this. I can train people. I can provide you some facilitators, but we've got to get the hospital to buy into it. And most often, the most successful groups are when there's somebody within the hospital system, typically a nurse on labor and delivery or mother-baby, who, you know, had an experience and sees these moms leaving the hospital and like, oh, I wish I could help these moms. So then we typically, you know, somehow they connect with us and we find another facilitator, whether, you know, just a mom in the area who's contacted us for help or whatever, and we pair them up. And those are typically our best support groups, if we have somebody from the hospital system as one of the facilitators.
That's great. Really helpful and such a great perspective. I think it always boils down to champions, right, in the hospital. And those of you who are on the line who don't have a nonprofit that you've already been partnering with, which I suspect is most of you, wish you had an Adrian, right, a nonprofit, Postpartum Virginia, but you've become champions for the reasons that Adrian has mentioned or perhaps personal experience. Adrian, thank you for pointing that out. So I do think there may be some other nonprofit organizations, although likely individual advocates on the line who don't have nonprofits behind them who want to do this work and start to outreach hospitals. So it's a great mix of folks. I'm going to move into some additional questions here. Adrian, can you tell us, is there a time of day that you found works best for moms, given the points you've already made about childcare and sort of
sure.
problems?
Yep, so the groups that we offer in the morning that typically meet from like 10 to 11:30 or 10:30 to 12 is a really good time frame, because then moms also stick around and go out to lunch at the hospital cafeteria or walk down the street to a restaurant or something like that. So we also find it, you know, it gives them some structure for the middle of the day. You remember what it was like to be home with a newborn. You're like, what the heck am I going to do today? So we find that, you know, having it sort of in that late morning, middle of the day really gives them something to hang their hat on for that day. We do offer a few evening groups. And those typically go from 7:30 until 9. It gives the opportunity for, you know, if there's other children in the home, for partner to get home, to get those kids settled with dinner or bedtime or whatever, and then mom can head out. And it's really funny, we had one mom who would come to our support group even after the baby was well. She just kept coming, and then it became her ladies' night out. Like, she just had that on the calendar as her time, and it became sort of inviolate in her family. So those are really the two times that we have found that works best.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. We have people asking, you know, if you are an outsider to the hospital, how do you get in? Do you just try to schedule an appointment with the hospital? Do you find an L&D nurse? What's your approach been?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So the best place to start, if you can find the person who's in charge of women's services at a hospital. And so that's typically a nurse who has become an administrator. And so women's and children's services typically come together under one person. And so that would include like labor and delivery, the mother-baby unit, NICU. You know, if you can find that person, that's a good place to start. The other good place is if there's a social worker affiliated with women's services. There may be a social worker in the NICU if you happen to have a large NICU. Those are two good places to start. And, you know, I struggle with this still, trying to get into a hospital. And usually it's, you know, you just kind of eventually find the right person. I wish there were a magic bullet for this one. If anybody knows, you know, share it with me, please.
That's great. I mean, your point is that this, like you said earlier, is just, it's hard work, and you've persevered. There's no magic bullet. But great. No, that's a helpful answer.
There's one other person that some hospitals have somebody called a perinatal navigator. That's also a great person to find.
Oh, great. And you know what we'll do, everyone, is you see the overview of Adrian's program in the handouts here. And Adrian, if you don't mind, I think we'll add some of this Q&A to that document.
Sure.
So it's very robust. Good. So next question is, tell us, like, how many are your trainers volunteers? So your peers and your clinicians, are volunteering to do this work, or do they get paid?
No, everybody who leads our support group is a volunteer. Now, maybe in one group, the group that I started with, my friend Jill, because she was already a nurse on staff at that hospital leading the new mothers group, she just sort of added this other group as part of her portfolio of work. But all of the other 19 or whatever, how many groups we have going at any given time, they're all volunteers. Now, some may be a nurse or a lactation consultant affiliated with the hospital, but they're leading the group as a volunteer, not as part of their paid staff position. But I will say my goal is that the hospitals will eventually own these groups and pay somebody to run the groups. You know, it should be somebody within that hospital system, whether it's the social worker or a nurse from Mother Baby. Like, it should be part of the hospital's portfolio. And so, you know, that's what I'm going to start moving toward, because you know, it's tough to find volunteers and manage all these volunteers all around the state. So, you know, that's my idea, my ideal.
That's great. So you're saying, like, the end goal is really to have both the peers and the clinicians that run these groups be paid by the hospitals, and that hospitals would find value in doing that. So that's helpful and
right.
Makes a whole lot of sense. Great. We heard from one person who is saying that that her counseling agency has started a new support group and was approached, you know, because they were approached by several women. They've had 2 sessions so far, a total of 12 women and 2 babies, monitored by 2 therapists, and that they're receiving a great deal of interest from local hospitals. So we just wanted to give you a shout out, like, congratulations, and we hope that you are finding this session helpful. And if there's anything else you want to add, please let us know through that comment section. All right.
Hey, Joy, I do want to add one thing. I know we're out of time, but this is really, really important. We very carefully screen our volunteer facilitators to make sure that, number one, they have fully recovered from their experience with a maternal mental health disorder.
Oh, great. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we want to make sure that, like, for example, when we hold a training session, we ask that women who attend, that their baby be at least a year old and that they have fully recovered. Because, you know, we talk about really, really serious things. We talk about, you know, intrusive thoughts and thoughts of harm to self or others, thoughts of suicide. We cover all these very, very difficult situations, and we want to make sure that we are not re-triggering anything for a woman who hasn't fully recovered.
You know what, thank you for that. And let me also point out that one of the things that we're going to be uploading to our sites, perhaps both of our sites, is that there's a checklist for a sort of personality and experience match for peer-led and even clinician-led support groups that we think will be helpful for folks to see. It's been developed by another organization who hasn't sent it to us yet, and that should be available soon. So we want to encourage people to take a look at that. We'll send it out to all of you when it becomes available. Thank you so much for pointing that out, that it's critical that babies are at least 1 year old, and maybe you even suggest like 6 months out from recovery, and it's often hard for women to identify have they fully recovered, but it does sound like you're really trying to account for that.
Right. And the other thing I want to point out, although we've talked about having, you know, a clinician as one of the facilitators, I want to make very clear that this is not a therapy group. And even if we had, say, a social worker as one of our support group leaders, she's not acting as the therapist. She is acting as, you know, a facilitator and a peer support. So, you know, very different. It's not a therapy session, and we will, you know, put on our different hats. We say, okay, I'm going to put on my therapist hat for a session and for a second and say, hey, I think maybe the issue that you're dealing with could be better addressed in individual therapy, and here's some therapists' names. You know, it's probably, you know, a situation or a topic that the support group doesn't have the knowledge to address. So, you know, I just want to make that clear that this is really, you know, peer support in its most fundamental form, talking about experience, what we did to recover, the lessons that we've learned, but it is not one-on-one therapy.
That's incredibly helpful. Let me ask one additional question, and it's an important one. You hit on it earlier, is someone points out that they really found that it was hard to do support groups in a hospital setting because of this link to birth trauma and just that, disassociation that maybe my clinicians during my birth experience didn't really treat me well or acknowledge the difficulties of labor and kind of dismissed things, and it just didn't feel like a safe place to go back to. Do you mind just hitting on that before we conclude?
Sure, and that is really the one significant downside that I find to having the support groups based primarily in hospitals. But as I said, if a mom, is triggered by perhaps coming to the specific hospital where she delivered, we can encourage her to go to one of the other local hospitals. We also have started, there are virtual support groups, which can be extremely helpful, particularly if mom is feeling those triggers that come with a traumatic birth. And we spend a lot of time talking about our birthing experience in our support group. We find that many, many, many women, myself included, had a very traumatic birth, and we talk that the trauma is in the eye of the beholder. The medical community may have thought that the birth was a medical success, but mom is really feeling like she was not heard, or that she didn't have the birth that she wanted. So we spent a lot of time talking about that, and it's very, very common. Like I said, there's no perfect place, but we really have found that for all of the reasons that I listed, that having the support group in the hospital is our preferred way of doing things. One thing that I would offer is, if you have a mom that you've talked to on the phone who expresses those concerns about coming to the hospital, you can meet her, off-site, meet her for a cup of coffee and explain the support group, and maybe she'll be enticed to come.
Well, we have a ton of additional comments and questions that came in. We are at the top of the hour and just a little bit over, so we're going to conclude today's session. What is resonating with me, though, that I want to share with all of you is that one of the new platforms that 2020 Mom is launching under a new name, which we're not going to go into all those details, is a learning network. And it feels to me like this should be a component. One of our learning networks will be a hospital learning network, that support groups can really be a component of that work. And if you have more burning questions or comments, we want you to, we see some of these in our control panel, but please email me directly, joy@2020mom.org, with your questions. If you don't feel like we've addressed them today, we want to keep this dialogue going. I think we might even have another maybe open call with Adrienne if she's willing to kind of vet some of the questions and comments that are coming up today. Adrienne, on behalf of all of us, thank you. You really are going to help move the needle throughout the United States. All these great women and advocates who are on today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Again, feel free to email me, joy@2020mom.org, if you have additional questions that you feel like weren't addressed, and we're going to make sure we have an opportunity to get you connected to people who are doing the same work, including Adrienne, for another Q&A session. Adrienne, I hope you're willing, and thank you so
Absolutely.
much. Super. Any final questions or comments or comments from you, Adrienne?
No, thank you again for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and I am more than happy to answer further questions. You can email me. I'm happy to come back online again. So thank you. I'm thrilled to be part of this.
Fantastic, and there's no doubt there'll be a part 2 here. There's a lot of great energy and questions coming in. Thank you so much, everybody. Please go ahead and email me again if you have more interest in this topic or have additional questions. We'll make sure we can address a way to continue this convening and conversation. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.